This is Liberty Under Attack Radio, hosted by Shane and Matt. Your place for documented truth and where freedom is the only agenda. We must end the terror war.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to Liberty Under Attack Radio on the Freedom Phalanx Radio Network. As always, I'm broadcasting worldwide from the communist state of Illinois, more specifically Central Illinois. Just a short 2 hours away from the FBI-coined crime capital of the world, known as Chicago. The number to call is 218-895-3818 or on Skype at FPRN Radio Live. We don't have much, if any, time tonight for callers, but if you have something to add to the subject this evening, we'd certainly love to hear from you. I'm your host, Shane, and I am joined by my co-host, Matt. Good to have you back on, brother. How's it going?
Oh, good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, obviously, no problem. You have a new article out, correct? Why don't you inform the listeners of your new series?
Right. Well, this is inspired by Kyle Rearden mentioning the Federalist Papers, and being the anarchist I am, I thought I'd do an examination of them. So that's where my series is coming from. I'm going to examine them from an anarchist perspective.
Okay, yeah. And I definitely recommend everyone go check out Matt's article. You can do that at tiny.cc/anarchist-odyssey. Again, tiny.cc/anarchist-odyssey. And I'll get back to the website here in just a moment. I want to thank everyone for tuning in this evening. The date is June 14th, 2015, and we've certainly got quite the broadcast planned. If you are on Facebook or you don't like the LUA page on Facebook, you might be unaware of the Goliath of a task that we have before us. We'll also be joined once again by Kyle Rearden from the Last Bastille blog in just a few moments here. But before we move forward, there are some exciting updates I'd like to mention first. For those that are unaware, the site was down for about 5 days a short while ago. We transitioned over to WordPress.org and have set up a more functional, better-looking, and better-designed website. Everything was on there that was on the old site, but there are a couple of new features that we are able to incorporate. First off, we do have the ability to open up a store on our site now, and that isn't done now, and it won't be for a while, but we have the option. Second, we set up a Support Us page on the website. If you like what you hear and you want to help us keep this operation going, we'd certainly appreciate any assistance. There's donate buttons for Bitcoin or PayPal. So definitely go check it out and let us know what you think. And I think that's everything for now. Matt, did I miss anything?
I don't think you did.
All right, awesome. Well, I'd like to provide a few quotes to guide us into this evening's main event, titled The United Police States of America. The first is by Frederick Bastiat. Quote, sometimes the law defends plunder and participates in it. Sometimes the law places the whole apparatus of judges, police, prisons, and gendarmeries at the service of the plunderers and treats the victim, when he defends himself, as a criminal, end quote. The second is from Justice Louis Brandeis, who says, quote, to declare that in the administration of criminal law, the end justifies the means, to declare that the government may commit crimes in order to secure conviction of a private criminal would bring terrible retribution, end quote. And from both of these gentlemen, we can identify a couple of themes. Bastiat acknowledged the danger of law, especially in regards to the liberties of the people, and also recognizes the inherent violence and corruption of the state. Brandeis acknowledges that entrapment in and of itself would bring terrible retribution. That is something we unfortunately see very frequently. The most recent example of that, the most recent found guilty party, was Ross Ulbricht. Ulbricht was found guilty of the following charges on May 29th, 2015, for violating 21 U.S.C. sections 841, 848, 1030, 1028, and 1956. Simply put, Ulbricht was convicted on various charges of aiding and abetting the distribution of illicit narcotics, leading an organized criminal syndicate, forging identification documents, and conspiring to launder money and hack computers. For the victimless crime of providing a market service for customers to safely trade illicit narcotics, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, where he is expected to rot away the rest of his life in a government dungeon. One final note in passing, the FBI agents that investigated the Silk Road are now facing charges. Most recent example before Ulbricht was a man named William Wolfe. Wolf is a Montanan patriot who is also the host of the Montana Republic broadcast on Blog Talk Radio. He was arrested on March 25th, 2015 by the federal government on the charge of allegedly violating 18 U.S. Code, Section 922, Paragraph O. His case is still being adjudicated. And for those interested, we do have all of the court documents for Wolf, as well as for Ulbricht, available on the LUA site under the Political Prisoners tab. So that should set the stage for the adventure that we're about to take together this evening. It is our goal to prove once and for all that 21st century America is living under a violent, monopolistic, freedom-destroying police state. So, Kyle, I want to welcome you back to Liberty Under Attack Radio. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing quite well, and it's always a pleasure to speak truth to power alongside both Matt and you, Shane. So thank you for having me on again.
Oh, yeah, no problem. We enjoy having you on. We definitely enjoy having you on. So, the thesis for this evening, which I've kind of already mentioned, is America is a police state and is one of the best ways to enforce statism. The inevitable end of statism is democide. So, Kyle, I think it'd be beneficial if we provide some definitions before we get started, kind of make some distinctions. So, what is a police state?
A couple different ways of defining a police state, but for tonight, I think the simplest way to explain it is that a police state is an authoritarian government's arbitrary use of power, especially through its own police forces.
Simply put, that works. I also think it's important. There's a lot of different avenues that this could go down, whether it be welfare state, warfare state, nanny state. Why don't we make the distinction between those real quick before we move forward?
Sure. Well, I guess with the warfare and welfare state, I guess you could put those two together, although they are different elements. Simply put, the warfare-welfare state is a type of authoritarian government that uses both its military and bureaucracy to hegemonically dominate both foreigners and citizens. To further explain this, the warfare state portion of it is what many people would call the military-industrial complex. When former U.S. Marine Smedley Butler wrote his seminal work, War is a Racket, this was kind of what he's talking about. And then, of course, the administrative agencies, which I've spoken about before and written about before, they're pretty much the main driver or otherwise the main tool used to make the welfare state happen. So when you have a warfare state or a welfare state, or worse, a combination of the two, the warfare-welfare state, that's what we're talking about. Military and bureaucracy run amok and otherwise being very authoritarian.
Okay. All right. So what is democide?
Well, democide is simply death by government. More specifically, it is where governments outright murder their own citizens, either in sudden batches, as was done throughout World War II and actually throughout the 20th century in general, or as is more commonly done, at least in the so-called Western countries like the North American continent and so forth, individually over time. So, for instance, like pre-20th century, democide figures are currently roughly over 133 million people, citizens murdered by government. And then the 20th century is 151 plus million citizens murdered by their own governments. And let me add one caveat. The democide figures specifically exclude war. So war casualties, whether it's soldiers or civilians, those are not counted. So the democide figures are actually in addition to war.
And that's a pretty large number, an astonishing number. So I also think it's important to define mala in se and mala prohibita, and also the precautionary principle, but we'll move one at a time. What is mala in se?
Mala in se, that's the plural form. Malum in se is singular. But mala in se is basically the concept of an action or a series of actions being evil in and of itself. Acts that are naturally unethical or immoral. For example, this would be actions like murder, kidnapping, rape, theft, fraud. Basically, any violation of the non-aggression principle is pretty much mala in se. Violating person and property as it would be. So that's kind of the idea there.
Okay. What is mala prohibita?
Mala prohibita, the singular form is malatum prohibitum. but mala prohibita in the plural means outlawed by the state. Sometimes what it's outlawed by the state would coincide with what is genuinely evil in and of itself, but as time has gone on with this police state, such as a divergence, and now you could even say in much of it that they're almost mutually exclusive, although thankfully the government, at least some people would consider this thankfully, still prosecute like homicide cases and such, but that's becoming less and less common. Actions that would count as mala prohibitum, and strictly that, where they're not evil in and of itself, would be things like truancy, copyright infringement, tax evasion, driving without a license, so-called, or even something like here in Texas, burning the Lone Star flag is apparently illegal. So basically anything that is outlawed is pretty much mala prohibitum.
Mm-hmm. Legally illegal, in other words.
Something like that, yeah.
There was something in the chat, I think it was, since we just defined democide. Yes, a disarmed society is a major driver towards democide. That's definitely correct.
It makes it a lot easier. So if you're a ruler, a statist, and a tyrant, and you want to go around murdering people, it's a lot easier to commit said democide if your intended victims cannot fight back. So there is a mitigating factor here, but for purposes of tonight, that would probably not be quite appropriate to go into, just because there's a lot of material on the subject, like by what Professor Rummel wrote about and such.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I actually we'll move forward. What is the precautionary principle?
Precautionary principle is this idea that, to put it simply, if anything is risky, you should err on the side of caution. The problem, and I will admit, when I was younger, I didn't quite understand this, and I have a better appreciation of now. It's the precautionary principle is not necessarily evil in and of itself, shall I put it. It's more of a manipulation by statists, by tyrants. What they do is that they take the precautionary principle and they twist it to suit their own ends. For example, when you look at certain types of mala prohibitum, like dumpster diving, they try to outlaw it or make it legally dubious to kind of, I'm an officer, why are you rummaging around in that dumpster and so forth? Because we don't want you to hurt yourself, so we're gonna have our police harass you, maybe even arrest you, protect you from yourself, of course. That's how they manipulate the precautionary principle and such. And also when you look at other things like seatbelt laws, or as many of your listeners I'm sure can appreciate, coercive medical insurance, if you know what I mean. We're gonna go after you and harm you for your own good because you're not buckling down to our demands. And the common, let me sum it up this way: the common theme behind all of this is the notion of negative externalities. So you don't obey the government with, putting the seatbelt on or getting the insurance that they want and so forth, because otherwise to not do so is to create a negative externality, and especially something I think Matt can appreciate. Many people would consider government itself to be a negative externality, but of course nobody doesn't like to. They don't like to mention that, of course.
So let's continue forward. So obviously it's not cheap to fund a police state. It's rather expensive. So how is this massive, violent, monopolistic police state funded, Kyle?
There are many ways of funding it, and that would be a broadcast in and of itself. But to cover it briefly here, I would say the most important one to mention right out of the gate is central banking. There are many ways this can manifest itself, but probably the two most important would be inflation and debt. If you can pass the costs of so-called government law enforcement off onto the unborn, then of course you can buy things like really expensive pieces of equipment, which I believe we'll get to in a little bit here. But yes, central banking with inflation and debt, civil asset forfeiture, which we'll mention in a little bit here, which anybody who's read my work or listened to previous interviews knows I'm not a big fan of. I kind of want to abolish it if at all possible. Taxation just in general, depending on how the taxes are being, where they got the money from, and then, of course, how it's being allocated out, which, of course, would be a broadcast in and of itself, going through the 20 million different details of how all that works, because with government, nothing can ever be simple.
Of course not.
And then, of course, you have to consider the non-tax sources of revenue, which is something a lot of people don't consider. Things like user fees or even, for lack of a better term, civil infraction fines. Some other things worth mentioning would be like investment dividends. Actually, a lot of government agencies and entities will actually invest in a lot of businesses and multinational corporations and things of that nature. And a lot of that is revealed by, this would be a broadcast in of itself, but basically the Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports, or the CAFRs, really show the 20 million different details about how all that works. But a lot of that is where a lot of like police departments get funded, is because of either what some people have called, quasi-hidden slush funds or whatever. But it's those investment dividends, which are rather important. Some types of government bonds. Some people have alleged even T-bills can be used to fund the police. But even if it's not T-bills specifically, government bonds in general, if you loan the government money that they can use, then at some point, presumably, it'll trickle through 20 different layers and eventually get to the police. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, believe it or not, Shane, voluntary donations. Even in this era of central banking and civil forfeiture and all of these funding mechanisms that are inherently monopolistic, people still just freely donate money to the government as if it were a charity.
That itself blows my mind. I mean, what do they take, about 50% of your taxes each year, and they're going to voluntarily donate to this violent institution known as the police force. That's crazy.
Well, believe it or not, there are people who, mainline American public, many of them like big government, statism. It's just an is. So the point is that regardless of the specific method, the idea is that this swath of very different sources of revenue generation, shall I say, is all used to fund the police state. And, a lot of it is through, general revenue funds. Like right here in Texas, there's the Texas General Revenue Fund. And, that can kind of be its own political project in terms of, trying to learn, the inflows and outflows of all of that. You also have to consider other things, too, what some people would call legalized forms of extortion, things like speeding tickets or ordinance violations. Mm-hmm. That's used to fund the police state, too, at least in one sense or another. And then, of course, a lot of the constitutionalists remind me of this from time to time, but things like green mail, where through the congressional power of the purse, the federal government they managed to get the money from the several state governments and then return a portion of that money back with again 20 million different strings attached and conditionalities and so forth. So there's more than one way to fund a police state, because remember, police states do not come cheap. I mean, that's very important to emphasize. And so similarly, all the sources of getting funding it is quite the carnival, as it were.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot of ways they fund this police state. So not last week, but the week before, we covered administrative agencies. How do administrative agencies and bar attorneys tie into the police state?
Well, they're very important because the administrative agencies is essentially, they're the bureaucracy. Whether we're talking federal government or several state governments, the administrative agencies are basically the bureaucracies. And, of course, the bar attorneys are all licensed. They're all licensed to practice law. And if you practice law without a license, that's a mala prohibita too, apparently, as many people have unfortunately have experienced. So here's why they're important, because the police state is not just about the police, it's also all about these other government agents as well. So I'll explain it this way, Shane. The bureaucrats and the attorneys write the rules for the police state, especially when you consider legislators. Most legislators are lawyers. So in this sense, the bureaucrats and the attorneys are worse than the cops, because the cops are just simply lapdogs. I mean, I'm sure people can go back in the literature and other sources years back and find, some cops saying, I'm just following orders, or I'm enforcing the law, or, cliched phrases like that, because they are cliches. But if you think about it, as bad as the cops are, the government police, they're just lapdogs. They're not the brains behind this system. the closest thing to the brains behind the system that I can find is a combination of the bar attorneys, like judges and prosecutors, people more like that. And then, of course, the various bureaucrats of all shapes, flavors, and sizes.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing I want to mention, too, although government police do enjoy something called qualified immunity, the judges are actually noticeably worse because they enjoy something called sovereign immunity. So if that kind of gives you an idea of kind of a pecking order, so, the cops have a lot higher probability of actually losing their jobs, all other variables held constant, rather than a judge who has a higher level of government protection that, of course, reduces his own individual responsibility for his own actions, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think a good way to put it probably is it's the legal concept used to legitimize the abuse of the precautionary principle. I think that'd be a good justifies the use of the sword. So is there anything else you want to mention before we move forward to our second segment here? Kyle or Matt? Matt, hop in if you have anything to add.
Nothing at this point.
Okay. We will move forward then.
Well, actually, I do want to kind of stress one thing, if I may.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
A lot of people now, obviously, you had me on before to mention the administrative agencies, but there are a couple details I do want to kind of mention here because it bears worth repeating, and it also illustrates the relationship between the bureaucrats and the attorneys. In July of 1944, the American Bar Association drafted the Administrative Procedures Act, and the evidence for that is found at Volume 30, Number 7. Of the July 1944 issue of the American Bar Association Journal. So quite literally what Senator Patrick McCarran announced according to the Congressional Record of 1946, the creation of a fourth branch of government was it was actually, I hate to use the word, but you could say there was a kind of like open or semi-open conspiracy of sorts, kind of analogous to that of Jekyll Island with the bankers and the Federal Reserve, where basically the lawyers got together, these ABA attorneys got together, and they plotted to establish at least the federal bureaucracy, during World War II, and then after the war ended, they rolled out the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act 1946, and then McCarran just announced like, hey, we're setting, the legislative branch, the U.S. Congress, is unilaterally setting up a completely different branch of government that is not enumerated in the federal Constitution of 1787, and we're just doing it. So, and you could say in a lot of ways that the bar attorneys basically kind of gave birth or otherwise did a steroid shot in the arm to the bureaucracy. So the attorneys and the bureaucrats very much are hand in glove in a lot of ways. And then, of course, that kind of rippled out to the several states, and like Texas here, it was pretty much during the 70s when it was at least codified, because technically it was actually pre-existing. But yeah, it's but like with a lot of the stuff we're going to be mentioning tonight, a lot of it, the reason why it's so draconian and all that is because it's the bureaucrats and the bar attorneys that actually sat around in a room and thought this stuff up and made it happen. And then it's only later when the government police are ordered, officer, what's your face, go out and shut down that kid's lemonade stand.
Officer friendly.
Yeah, officer friendly. Yeah, an officer not so friendly, Matt. I think you got that right. So that's kind of the idea here. So I want that to be absolutely clear before moving forward as to who the enemy is that those are the people who did it. It was the bureaucrats and the attorneys. So I know a lot of people are angry at the police, and a lot of that is justified in a lot of ways. And we'll kind of explain as we go along here. But I really want to take a little bit of time here and emphasize why they act the way they do, at least in part. It's because they're getting their marching orders from these two other batches of people, the bureaucrats and the attorneys, and specifically like judges, legislators, people like that. A lot of guys with power. Yeah, basically. And I think that's very important to emphasize the hierarchy that is inherent in statism, especially the kind we're facing today.
Yeah, certainly a good point. So let's move forward to this second segment and try to get through this first part before we go to our first break here. And the second segment's regarding police militarization. And we're going to be discussing government policing as a coercive monopoly. And the first thing I want to touch on is an academic white paper for, I think it was the Seton Hall constitutional law. I think that was where it was for. But it's a white paper by Roger Roots titled "Are Cops Constitutional?" It's a decent length, but I do recommend everyone read that. It's very historical, and he does a very, very good job of laying it out in a pretty simplistic way, and there's about 300 plus sources, so plenty of follow-up research for anyone to do if you're bored, which no one really has an excuse to be bored, but regardless, moving forward, I selected some excerpts out of this I think are important that really tie into tonight's broadcast. First off, J. Edgar Hoover in the 1920s, his FBI came to epitomize the police profession in its sleuth and intelligence gathering role. FBI agents infiltrated mobster organizations, intercepted communications between suspected criminals, and gathered intelligence for both law enforcement and political purposes. Moving forward, at the time of the nation's founding, any citizen was privileged to resist arrest if probable cause for the arrest did not exist, or the arresting person could not produce a valid arrest warrant where one was needed. And that's definitely not the case today. If you resist, you are definitely probably going to get tased or beaten. And the worst outcome is you could be killed too.
Maimed and or killed.
And or killed, yes. So, yeah, I think that's important. Moving forward, violent resistance was considered a lawful remedy for Fourth Amendment violations. So, violent resistance against law enforcement. Yeah, that was part of the founding of this nation. Definitely can't do that today.
Wait a minute, Shane. Wouldn't that be resisting arrest now as a mala prohibita?
Oh, yeah, that would be, you would be resisting arrest, and you would face charges. You might face, like, assault on a cop, too, which they like to toss that one in there, too. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, definitely.
How dare you seek a deterrent from state terrorism?
How dare you refuse to be taken to a government dungeon? Moving forward, the right to resist unlawful arrest can be considered a constitutional one. It stems from the right of every person to his bodily integrity and liberty of movement, among the most fundamental of all rights. And now we get to the historical corruption of the police, which some people are going to be surprised that, oh my God, the police have been corrupt. In the 1980s, the Houston police were found to have utilized an unofficial policy of planting guns on victims of police violence. 75 to 80% of all Houston officers apparently carried throwdown weapons for such purposes. Moving forward, in 1903, a former New York City police commissioner stated that he had seen, quote, a dreary procession of citizens with broken heads and bruised bodies, against few of whom was violence needed to effect an arrest, end quote. And he continues, the police are practically above the law, end quote. That was in 1903, and this New York City police commissioner acknowledged that. But there's still some police state deniers and sympathizers today, which is it's not really that surprising when you look at the statism rampant in the United States. Moving forward, 98% of all fatal workplace injuries occur in the civilian labor force. Police don't even rank in the top 10. So it's not a dangerous job, regardless of what they say. It's not, and that can be documented by their own numbers. Police practices ranked as the number one cause of violent urban riots in the 1960s. Some authorities regard police perjury as so rampant that it can be considered a, quote, subcultural norm rather than an individual aberration of police officers. In Detroit, repeated corruption allegations have seen a number of low and high-ranking officers go to prison for drug trafficking, hiring hitmen, providing drug protection, and looting informant funds. Police burglary rings have been uncovered in several cities. Moving forward, last couple of points here. For years, Boston police simply made up imaginary informants to justify searches and seizures, which is, before I read this, me and Kyle had conversations like, well, where do they get these imaginary informants? And we both kind of agreed that they're probably calling each other to go raid houses and such. There's a source for that now. Last two, road travel itself is subject to a near total level of police control. And the last one, in cases where police misconduct is an issue, police use their monopoly over the crime scene to prepare the evidence to suit their versions of events. So, we're coming up on this first break. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this short few minutes here.
Is it the American This is Niz from Disassociation Nation. As many of you know, I'm an avid vapor. And if you're like me, you're tired of being charged ridiculous amounts of cash for a disappointing experience when flavors just don't deliver. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to Vapor Renew, a Flavor West company. If you're into mixing and creating your own custom e-liquids, Flavor West has everything you need to make delicious, satisfying flavors. Doesn't matter if you're a flavor chaser or if you love the look and feel of those big, beautiful, puffy plumes. FlavorWest.com can provide you with everything you need. Let's face it, if you vape, e-liquid is an ongoing expense. And if you're a dripper like me, then you know that blowing through a $30 bottle of juice isn't unheard of. Why pay more than you have to? So for excellent quality juice made right here in the United States, head over to VaporRenew.com where they have hundreds of flavors pre-mixed and ready to vape at the most reasonable prices you'll find. Use coupon code RENU for an extra 10% off your entire order. Great juice at a great price and 10% off. Support companies that support liberty by making your next purchase at Vapor Renew. Or for mixing supplies, don't forget FlavorWest.com.
doTERRA Essential Oils, true gifts of the earth, provide you with the perfect prepper tool, the Family Physician Kit. 10 certified pure, therapeutic-grade oils to provide the care you need for your family's everyday health concerns and potential medical issues you may encounter when sheltering in place or bugging out.
Visit EssentialNewParadigm.info to view the complete product line and ask how you can receive 25% off each and every order.
Don't delay. Your family's health depends on you. Health depends on you.
Do you have a group or organization founded on the principles of personal liberty, health freedom, or accountable government? We invite you to check out Same Side Entertainment. Get connected with leaders in the liberty movement like Tom Woods, Kevin Gutzman, Jack Hunter, Robert Scott Bell, Michael Scheuer, and many more. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and our website at www.samesideentertainment.com. Again, that's www.samesideentertainment.com. Same Side Entertainment, connecting you with the education and resources you need.
Thanks for listening to FPRN. Don't forget to check us out on Facebook and Twitter. If you'd like to start your own show with FPRN, advertise with us, or donate to the network or to your favorite shows, check out our website at www.fprnradio.com.
If I could have gotten 51 votes in the Senate of the United States for an outright ban, picking up every one of them, Mr. and Mrs. America, turn them all in, I would have done it.
No mind, no time, no society man's ever built with no spine, no power,
and
no
welcome
pain,
back to
no
Liberty Under Attack Radio. And you know what I would say at that last little intro clip? Come and take them. If you're just joining us, you're tuning into a special edition of Liberty Under Attack Radio titled The United Police States of America, where myself, Kyle Rearden from the Last Bastille blog, and my co-host Matt are proving that America is living under a police state. If you have anything to add to the show, feel free to call and chime in. That number is 218-895-3818 or on Skype at FPRN Radio Live. You can also email me at shane@libertyunderattack.com, and I can read that on air. So let's get back to it. And I think this is an important thing to touch on. So, Kyle, do cops have any legal duty to protect you or your property?
According to the judiciary itself, no. There are several cases that basically kind of explain this, but perhaps the quickest one to explain tonight would be Warren versus District of Columbia. Basically, here's what the judges said. Generally speaking, government police do not have a duty to protect anyone, whether it's the citizenry or foreigners or arguably even government agents. Basically, the police do not owe anyone a duty of protection at all. The only exception to that is that if a citizen or someone else, like a foreign dignitary or whomever visiting from Timbuktu or wherever, has a pre-existing special relationship with the police. If you don't have that special relationship, there is no duty of protection. The other case which I think is worth mentioning here is, of course, Minor versus Happersett. which was an 1874 case, and the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at that time, Chief Justice Waite, said, I think it was in paragraph 3, the following, and people really need to pay attention because this is really important. Quote, "The very idea of a political community such as a nation is implies an association of persons for the promotion of their general welfare. Each one of the persons associated becomes a member of the nation formed by the association. He owes it allegiance and is entitled to its protection. Allegiance and protection are, in this connection, reciprocal obligations. The one is a compensation for the other. Allegiance for protection and protection for allegiance." Close quote. So that's rather important. If the Judge Waite was correct by saying it's reciprocal obligations and it's protection for allegiance and allegiance for protection, and then you have the Warren case as well as many others. I know people sometimes mention DeShaney. But regardless, if indeed there is no constitutional duty of protection, then it does very much beg the question, do Americans, the citizenry, owe the government a duty of allegiance? I don't know the legal answer to that, but I think it's worth asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it's also important to point out that obviously, as we mentioned, taxation is a way to fund the police state and obviously fund police departments. So if you think about it that way, they have no legal duty to protect you. Then you're forced to pay for something that they don't even have to provide.
Yes, exactly. But then again, you have to keep in mind that government policing is a coercive monopoly, much like how you were kind of getting at with what Dr. Roger Roos was mentioning. And I would also like to kind of mention here, actually like to quote a Belgian economist who his name was Gustave de Molinari, and he wrote, this was back in 1849. Okay, so this was before the war between the states. And here's what Molinari said, quote, "If, on the contrary, the consumer is not free to buy security wherever he pleases, you forthwith see open up a large profession dedicated to arbitrariness and bad management. Justice becomes slow and costly. The police vexatious. Individual liberty is no longer respected. The price of security is abusively inflated and inequitably apportioned according to the power and influence of this or that class of consumers. The protectors engage in bitter struggles to wrest customers from one another. In a word, all the abuses inherent in monopoly or in communism crop up." Close quote.
Wow.
Yeah, if a Belgian economist in 1849 figured out that government policing is not a good idea, why, in goodness sakes, are Americans tolerating it today in 2015?
I think that's $1 million question, quite frankly. It is. That's...
Because police are sinless.
I think Matt hit it on the head there.
All right.
But yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, just that. But yes, it's worth mentioning about police militarization because now, in many ways, it's so much worse than what even Molinari's was kind of getting at back in his day.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk about it. Police militarization. Let's see. Weaponry, armor training, police academies. Go ahead, Kyle, kind of explain to us the militarization aspect of the police.
Many people would ascribe this to essentially a lot of predictive programming elements in television, like with TV shows like SWAT or whatever and what have you, where you've got police officers running around with rifles that you would really only see soldiers or militiamen use. And you could say that kind of incrementally did it, but you have to keep in mind, even the original SWAT teams were not all kitted up like they were, going to Fallujah. Okay, the only difference is that instead of being dressed in their usual uniform blues, they were just dressed out in like plain color BDUs and baseball caps. Like it wasn't really anything really special. And now they have full on body armor that, whether it's Kevlar and whatever else, and goggles and kind of the Nazi style helmets and such. Not to say anything of usually the one guy on the typical SWAT teams where they usually have a huge shield. Like they're trying to be like a Spartan or something, and the only thing missing is like a big lance or spear. I mean, it really is the rise of the warrior cop as I believe some authors and even mainstream journalists have mentioned. But yes, they are dressed up as if they are going to war, and you could say that's true because they're at war with the American citizenry. A lot of their police training kind of emphasizes this. Even when you had me on before to discuss unjust profiling. Remember, the cops are being told that this, the citizenry is this, domestic terrorism or extremism, or maybe the new version will be radical. I don't know. But the cops in their training, whether it's at the police academies or afterwards, are constantly being told that the citizens are scum, they're evil, bad people, how dare they have guns, and so forth. Because, of course, the monopoly can only be a monopoly if it has the monopoly on the use of force, whether legally or, shall I say, more practically in terms of armament and such. So that's a lot of the reason why you have a lot of this increasing militarization that even the ACLU has written about. So it's not just – and one other thing, too, about the weaponry. Consider also that while it is true there are certain types of weaponry that are accessible on the civilian market that are also available to the police, there's also some types of weaponry that are not available to the civilian market that is available to the police. Things like submachine guns.
Yeah.
So, it kind of just bears mentioning.
It's an imbalance of power. I mean, it's similar to taking away the guns because now they have the ability to use more force than we do.
You could arguably say it's like reverse democide in a sense, because if you have the police having access to weaponry that the citizenry does not, it's kind of, or maybe not reverse democide, but like reverse gun confiscation in a sense, which would make it easier for democide. Let me put it that way. So you don't necessarily. So this is kind of a lesser known thing lesser mentioned thing that I think bears mentioning here. You don't necessarily have to, as authoritarian statist types, you don't actually have to go and steal people's guns so much as you just prevent the arguably more destructive weaponry from being sold on the civilian market by like outlawing it and such. And that's where the bureaucrats and the attorneys kind of pop in.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's also worth a mention the LRADs, the MRAPs, the Bearcats, these tanks that they now have, and these I guess vehicles that used to only be used overseas are now being used against the American people. And I think that's another indicator as to who they're. It's an indicator as to who they're at war with, which is us.
Of course. And the LRAD, remember the very first time the LRADs were used were back in 2009 during the G20 protests in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And that's been caught on film, and I believe much of the footage is still available up on video sharing websites such as YouTube and Vimeo and others.
I'd like to return to a point real quick. As far as historically, police have always been abusive because you also have the issue of strike breaking.
Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't to say that I'm promoting communism or socialism, just that the abusive power of the state is there with the police using the enforcement, of course.
Yeah.
So please continue.
Well, but that's pretty much what they're good for, right? They're lapdogs. They're following the orders of bureaucrats or attorneys or whomever else. I mean, that's pretty much what's going on here. Because, of course, the attorneys themselves would never have the individual would never bear the individual responsibility for strapping on some Kevlar and using chemical weapons against protesters, like how many of the riot cops have, like they did at G20 Pittsburgh and many other places too. So, of course, the bureaucrats can't be bothered with that. We'll just let the government police deal with that. So, they in a sense they kind of get shat on too in a kind of roundabout way. But the point here is that this is not, big government is not some soft, cuddly thing. There are very much real-world consequences to this kind of thing.
It's a vicious bear.
That's probably a rather polite way of putting it. I was thinking more like a predatory parasite of some kind. But yeah, but that's what they're good for. So is it really any wonder that people are now talking about seriously engaging in self-defense against cops? Whether it's like Larkin Rose with his article and subsequent video, When Should You Shoot a Cop? Or Chris Cantwell's article entitled Dead Cops Mean Less Oppression. when you consider the militarization of the police, is it really any wonder there are people seriously being outspoken now, even libertarians, saying, wow, at some point in the future, we might even need to do what, that whole revolution thing at some point in the future. And of course, it's not illegal for any of us to mention this because of the Brandenburg versus Ohio case. So it's very interesting to watch everyone's reactions when it comes to police militarization. But yeah, it's very much a real problem. The only question at this point, though, is how to deal with it, which, of course, should be dealt with at another time.
Yep, I would have to agree. So let's move forward to police brutality. I mean, that's a subject that is heavily focused on by the alternative media, and I would say it's mostly a good thing, indeed. But I want to kind of give a different viewpoint here with it was a PBS documentary. And what was that called, Kyle? I can't remember.
I don't remember the exact name. It was an episode of like PBS's Frontline or something about North Korea. Yeah,
yep. So I do want to play a clip of a woman standing up to a soldier. And I do want to mention that this video is being played in conjunction with Section 107 of copyright law, fair use for the purposes of comic criticism and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. Producer, please cue up clip 1.
Illegal markets first began to appear when the state became unable to feed its people during the famine. Today, the state tolerates them, but people are pushing the limits of private enterprise. This woman is running an illegal private bus service. An army officer tries to stop her from picking up passengers.
People's willingness to confront or...
Okay, and I think that clip is very important. You saw the for those who are going to be listening to the archive, you saw this North Korean woman who was operating an illegal business. She was physically shoving and pushing this soldier cop. They are soldiers, and I think it's important to realize that this is in North Korea. I've seen plenty of stuff to where cops have beaten pregnant women for less here. So yeah, I think that's kind of interesting and a little bit telling, wouldn't you say, Kyle?
Oh, absolutely. The fact that she was able to get away with it, and if I remember correctly, I could have sworn that soldier in that particular clip was armed, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't pull out his gun, kind of like what happened here in Texas at that pool party that's been really big in the news cycle recently. And all that. So, if North Korean communist soldiers have more restraint and civility than the American gendarmerie, what makes America not a police state again?
That's a good question, isn't it? It's a good question.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, let's move forward here. So I want to discuss how many people the law enforcement officers have murdered since 9/11. So first I went from, there's a number kind of going around from, I think it originated from Mint Press, but they say that over 5,000 civilians have been killed by law enforcement since 9/11. But there's a website, and if you guys haven't heard of this, I recommend you check it out. It's pretty incredible. It's called killedbypolice.net. They've been archiving the number of civilians killed by police, and important part, whether justified or not, it's just every single incident that they can document to where a cop killed a civilian. And it's impossible to track all these, so it's an incomplete list. But in 3 years, they've documented 2,374 killing of civilians by cops. So in my opinion, I think that 5,000 number that's been circulating, I think that's a little low. I definitely think that's a little low. And in addition to that, the FBI and the federal government do not keep statistics on law enforcement killing civilians. So there's not really a for sure answer. The closest one you can get is at killedbypolice.net. So Kyle, Matt, thoughts on that? Anything?
Well, the FBI keeps a lot of statistics on violent crime, and they'll even keep statistics on how many so-called law enforcement officers get killed in the so-called line of duty. But of course, very rarely do they even keep slight records of how many civilians have been killed by cops. And generally speaking, they don't do so in any consistent way. And so the alternative and even mainstream corporate media have been trying to kind of haphazardly, as best as they can, actually, let me take that back. I don't mean haphazardly. Piecemeal. Have been trying to piecemeal document, like house raids on, that were at the wrong house, and then, like I remember one case there was an elderly man who thought he was being burgled. He got out his revolver, and because the cops saw him first, shot him, dead, much like Donald Scott back in the 90s. So it's it is what it is.
Yep. So let's keep the flow going. Peaceful protest. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
I just wanted to say that the overarching strategy is depopulation.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that at all. Cannot. Okay. Peaceful protesting. In a Department of Defense document, they declare that peaceful protesting is low-level terrorism. Is that correct, Kyle?
Yeah, I think this was mentioned before on the other broadcast about unjust profiling, and even the ACLU had to get involved in it too. But also consider too, when people go protesting, consider also how the riot cops act. When you consider techniques like kettling or baton charges, that really shows you how much regard the police have for your safety, and it really contradicts any notion that the police are here to serve and protect. Or at least serve and protect the citizenry, because, of course, if you're preventing people from freely leaving, which is what kettling is, or worse, you're directly in a huge line of officers who are all armored and kitted up with batons and tear gas, grenade launchers, and whatever else, chemical weapons, which are not allowed to be used in war pursuant to the Geneva Convention, using it against protesters, normal people, or even just normal bystanders who happen to be there, wrong place, wrong time, of course. And then they kind of break ranks at the same point and just rush at these people and then hit whomever they can come across. That's a baton charge. Who are they really serving and protecting?
Good question. I think the answer is known by anyone listening. Let's kind of discuss the agent provocateur, COINTELPRO aspect of it. I'd like to discuss the infiltration of protests here. So Kyle, can you give us a definition of what black bloc is?
The black bloc technique, it's a method, it's not a group, it's a method, is basically where protesters basically wear all black clothing and cover up their face a lot of the times with masks or handkerchiefs or whatever else. And they basically try to take like an amorphous black entity that can't be individually identified. In fact, the whole idea of a black bloc was to avoid being identified. And although that was kind of used as a method of what some people would consider leaderless resistance or direct action, unfortunately the cops are not completely stupid, and they figured out that they could infiltrate such a thing quite easily by dressing all in black themselves. In fact, I think it was actually during mentioned G20 Pittsburgh one more time. I think it was on September 26th of that year in 2009 when 3 cops were actually exposed as trying to infiltrate a black bloc. And thankfully, people turned their cameras on them and exposed them before they had a chance to do anything else. But initially, it seems like they were just conducting surveillance. But who knows? Maybe they would have provocateur. We'll never know. But the point was at least people found out that. And also, that was the other thing too. Even the way they were walking, and they weren't acting like everyone else in terms of their behavior, like talking jovially and all that. They were like quiet and peering around at everybody, being real paranoid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I didn't include that clip in here for the sake of time, but if you Google G20 Pittsburgh black bloc, it's at night. It's not hard to find. I'd like to talk about during these protests, we do see a lot of destruction of property, public and private, it seems like the mainstream media is focusing on whether it be out of towners, whether it be like the low income people. That are going in and looting and all of that stuff. I think it's important to bring up another aspect, which is highly prevalent. I think it needs to be addressed more, and that is the syndicalists, the anti-proprietarians. So can you give us a brief definition of what syndicalism is, Kyle?
Yeah, syndicalism is basically a political ideology that advocates for trade unionism without union bosses, which is kind of really interesting in one sense. They pretty much want to end both the state and capitalism, apparently. So that's where the anti-proprietarian or anti-private property attitude comes from. Now, why this is even slightly relevant is because at a lot of protests that end up turning into riots, or like more recently things like Ferguson or Baltimore, and what's been happening there in those different places, you actually have different entities of people doing very similar things. So when somebody is like breaking store windows and trashing cars and keying them and so forth, sometimes those are provocateurs and police agents and such. But other times it's actual genuine action by people who are ideologically driven, because they don't value private property. They do not think that vandalism and destruction of private property is a crime and all that, because they don't think here's the short version. They basically think that private property is an extension of the state instead of. But then again, they view government as proprietarian. Many of us libertarians view the government as actually being anti-proprietarian through things like taxation and so forth. So in a sense, the syndicalists kind of give a pretext to the cops to clamp down harder on everybody else, even if they don't mean to.
Yeah. Okay, moving forward, there's one other thing I want to kind of mention with the police militarization, police brutality. And that is the killing of dogs, and the as we've discussed, the blatant negligence for the life and safety of the citizens. For example, the flashbang in the baby's crib, who had third-degree burns after that incident, which is very, very horrific, very horrific. I did want to pull one thing from Larkin Rose here, and he explained. This is just paraphrased. It's in his video called "Cops Are Cowards." And he explained that one of the many cowardly acts of cops is the fact that they feel the need to kill the dog in almost every single instance. And I know that happens in a lot of SWAT raids, too. The dog always gets killed, it seems like. And that is similar to killing a human member of the family. Like, for those of you that have dogs, I mean, they are a member of the family. Like, it's a pretty traumatic thing. It's like killing a child almost. Before we go to break, let's discuss the indiscriminate use of tasers, mace, and pepper spray real quick. Why don't we, Kyle?
Sure. Now, this is an unfortunate development, and this kind of goes back to like the weaponry and the armor and the police academy training and post police academy training and such. Is this really kind of widespread, almost reckless use of the so-called non-lethal weapons like tasers, mace, and pepper spray. And, originally I wasn't able to find the legal citations in time for tonight, but I do remember from years back, several judges had actually said that, look, police can only use those kinds of non-lethal weapons only in situations where they would be legally justified in using deadly force. The only difference would be that instead of shooting somebody, they'd spray them or electrocute them or whatever else. However, now that enough time has passed by, and because the judiciary seems to be acquiescing to this, as much as I can tell, things like, the tasers specific are particularly pronounced more so than the others, where they're now used as pain compliance tools or compliance enforcement. The tasers specifically are quite literally a human version of a cattle prod. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. So they do treat us like cattle, tax cattle. So basically, generally speaking, with a lot of the citizenry, they basically steal our money through taxation and those other versions of funding I mentioned in the previous segment. And then whenever we, any one of us citizen types basically doesn't obey a so-called lawful order and basically beg and scrape and bootlick, then the officer has the discretion to whip out the taser and electrocute us or spray us or whatever else until we go, yes, massa, I'll do what you say. How high do you want me to jump and so forth.
Yep, and that's definitely how it is. I've seen too many videos of people that aren't doing anything wrong. It's on camera, obviously. There was one instance, I saw this on Niz's show, Dissociation Nation, another show here on FPRN. But the kid actually he was underage, and he was like, I'm not resisting. I'm a minor. Want my parents, my mom here, and I want my lawyer here. And he didn't obey the order. So they tasered him and drug him out of the car. So we're coming up to this second break here. We'll be right back in just a few minutes.
Hello, America. You believe in liberty? Well, fuck you! Why is it that every time I turn on internet radio, I can't seem to find one educated person with libertarian point of views? That's why I choose FPRN Radio! For liberty, goddammit!
doTERRA Essential Oils, true gifts of the earth, provide you with the perfect prepper tool, the Family Physician Kit. 10 certified pure, therapeutic-grade oils to provide the care you need for your family's everyday health concerns and potential medical issues you may encounter when sheltering in place or bugging out.
Visit essentialnewparadigm.info to view the complete product line and ask how you can receive 25% off each and every order.
Don't delay. Your family's health depends on you. Health depends on you.
This is Niz from Disassociation Nation. As many of you know, I'm an avid vapor. And if you're like me, you're tired of being charged ridiculous amounts of cash for a disappointing experience when flavors just don't deliver. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to Vapor Renew, a Flavor West company. If you're into mixing and creating your own custom e-liquids, Flavor West has everything you need to make delicious, satisfying flavors. Doesn't matter if you're a flavor chaser or if you love the look and feel of those big, beautiful, puffy plumes. FlavorWest.com can provide you with everything you need. Let's face it, if you vape, e-liquid is an ongoing expense. And if you're a dripper like me, then you know that blowing through a $30 bottle of juice isn't unheard of. Why pay more than you have to? So for excellent quality juice made right here in the United States, head over to VaporRenew.com where they have hundreds of flavors pre-mixed and ready to vape at the most reasonable prices you'll find. Use coupon code RENU for an extra 10% off your entire order. Great juice at a great price and 10% off. Support companies that support liberty by making your next purchase at Vapor Renew. Or for mixing supplies, don't forget FlavorWest.com.
Thanks for listening to FPRN. Don't forget to check us out on Facebook and Twitter. If you'd like to start your own show with FPRN, advertise with us, or donate to the network or to your favorite shows, check out our website at www.fprnradio.com.
Welcome back to Liberty Under Attack Radio. I'd like to read a quote by Patrick Henry real quick before we move forward. Quote, "Guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. Whenever you give up that force, you are inevitably ruined." End quote. So, if you're just joining us, we are proving America is a police state. Me, Kyle, and Matt. And we just got done discussing protesting and other tools in the arsenal of the police. So, Kyle, let's move forward to something called secret police. Can you define what secret police are real quick?
Sure. The secret police are basically that element of the government policing in general that is a lot more subtle. They're, I guess you could say they're the suit and tie guys. Or if they're on an undercover job, they may just look like you and sound like you and talk like you. And, much like I wrote in an article I wrote years ago, there's a quote I'd like to read from an individual by the name of Lee Adams, who basically convinced me that although there are many different types of secret police entities, not just the federal government, but also the several state governments here in America, but that if there had to be one that you had to really point to. Because they're kind of involved with just about everything. The most important secret police of the United States would really be the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Lee Adams once said, quote, "The FBI is not just a police agency, it is a security service. There are important differences between police agencies and security services. Every government has a security service. The mission of a security service is to suppress anti-government activity. This means that most governments see their own population as the most serious threat. It is a self-evident truth that the nastier the government, the nastier its security service. Referring to a security service as the thought police is not too far from the truth. The FBI, understandably, does not have a history of respect for civil rights in its capacity as a security service. The FBI's record of unconstitutional and illegal actions against American citizens is readily available to anyone who takes the trouble to investigate," close quote. So when you look at things like undercover operatives, agent provocateurs, like we mentioned last segment, or even civilian informants, those are all types of people that are basically that are part of the secret police.
Yeah, indeed. I'd like to move forward to one example, and we've discussed this previously on Liberty Under Attack Radio, but it's important here too. It was in 2011, I think it was 2011 or 2012, and this is from the Huffington Post. Quote, 3 young activists were acquitted of terrorism charges Friday, but convicted of mob action and arson-related felonies for their part in a supposed crime involving Molotov cocktails that was manufactured both figuratively and literally by the Chicago Police Department, and likely the FBI, in the lead-up to the May 2012 demonstrations against the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So there you have one of those instances of entrapment. And let's move forward. There was an instance earlier on this year, I think it was, where a CIA black site called Homan Square in Chicago. This is from The Guardian. Quote, "The Chicago Police Department operates an off-the-book interrogation compound, rendering Americans unable to be found by family or attorneys while locked inside what lawyers say is the domestic equivalent of a CIA black site. The facility, a nondescript warehouse in Chicago's west side known as Homan Square, has long been the scene of secretive work by special police units. Interviews with local attorneys and one protester who spent the better part of a day shackled in Homan Square describes operations that deny access to basic constitutional rights." So I think it's important there. They set him up and then they took him to this to Homan Square, even though for I guess probably enhanced interrogation, even though they already knew exactly what he did. So you guys, any thoughts before I move forward?
Gotta love that entrapment.
Oh yeah,
it's just daily operating procedure.
Indeed, and we'll prove that with this next example here. It was anarchist plot to blow up the Cleveland Bridge. ABC News says that, quote, "A gang of anarchists arrested for allegedly plotting to blow up a Cleveland, Ohio bridge. Also talked about attacking an upcoming NATO summit in Chicago and this summer's Republican National Convention in Florida, according to authorities. The FBI said they used the informant to facilitate the men getting C4 explosives that they would use to target the bridge. According to the criminal complaint, Stevens and Stafford were recruited towards the end of their planning to help them execute the attack. The men were arrested as they allegedly arranged to pick up the explosives," end quote. Oh yeah, and by the way, that NATO summit that they discussed in this article, it's the exact same one where the FBI and Chicago PD set up the NATO 3 protesters previously discussed, and I don't really think that's a coincidence. So, World Trade Center 1993 bombing. Kyle, why don't you tell us a little about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people remember 9/11, but remember that was the second so-called terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. There was actually an earlier one. Almost a decade before, back in 1993, same year that the Waco siege happened here in Texas. But this one was, the 1993 WTC bombing was actually rather interesting because the FBI was involved. In fact, their informant, a former Egyptian army officer named Imad Salem, was very much involved with that, and it's also been reported as well that the FBI actually cooked the bombs and handed it to the patsies. And then, of course, they all got taken down in a heroic raid, and all of this kind of jive statist propaganda drivel. So that's kind of what we're involved in, basically. The secret police basically set up guys who are either mentally ill or crazy or fill in the blank, and so that they can whoosh in and they can declare themselves to be our saviors. So basically what I'm saying is that it's the Hegelian dialectic in action, that problem, reaction, solution. They cause the problem, people freak out, they have a reaction, and the solution is always some tyrannical, despotic thing that violates the U.S. Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And I think it's safe to say that the secret police are the ones carrying out these false flag operations, and they obviously use patsies. I think it's also important, as we can see, the infiltration and entrapment of protesters, such as with the previous examples. They infiltrate, they entrap, and they break up citizens groups. And I think that's important to mention in passing, at least. I'd like to move forward here. They also trip people up on legal technicalities, which are almost always victimless crimes. And I want to mention one example here, which I think is rather horrific. And the headline reads, Autistic Kid Tricked into Buying Pot by Cop. And this is a Reason article. Quote, we felt like our family was totally violated by the sheriff's department in the school district, says Doug and Catherine Snodgrass of Temecula, California. Last December, their 17-year-old autistic high school son was arrested after twice buying marijuana for an undercover Riverside County police officer. The undercover operation, titled Operation Glasshouse, spanned a few months and included undercover officers in 3 area high schools, Chaparral, Temecula Valley, and Rancho Vista continuation. The officers posed as regular high school students and would ask other students for drugs. 22 students were arrested. The majority of them are reported to be special needs students, like the Snodgrass son, end quote. Gotta love public schooling.
Well, one more reason to get your kids out, if you have any still left, in the government indoctrination camps.
Yeah, no shit there.
Gotta love that subservience.
It's outrageous. Outrageous. So I'd like to move forward to conspiracy charges. It's sort of a pre-crime thing, like you saw in the Minority Report years back. This is from 18 U.S. Code sections 3056 and 1752. These codes explain the increased powers of the Secret Service. And we're only going to mention this part in passing, but there is an excerpt that I think is extremely important. Quote, whoever attempts or conspires to knowingly enter or remains in any restricted building or grounds defined as where the president or other person protected by the Secret Service is or will be temporarily visiting shall be fined under this title $1,000 or imprisoned for not more than 1 year or both, assuming there is said person who does not carry a firearm or cause a significant bodily injury. And I do recommend everyone go check out those codes. Again, it's United States Code 18 U.S.C. sections 3056 and 1752. And the reason this is important is it's much easier for the Secret Service or law enforcement officers to slap the cuffs on you if you're even near someone under the protection of the Secret Service, knowingly or unknowingly. And I would say probably for Bilderberg's happening. I think it's happening right now, actually. Like for protesters there, obviously there are probably some people there that are protected by the Secret Service. So this is extremely dangerous. It's obviously the NATO summits as well. Republican and Democrat conventions. I would think this is pretty important.
Organization.
Kyle, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, notice that you, the plebeian Americans, are not allowed to be around the king or his or the other members of the American royal family. I mean, my goodness. I mean, the phrasing in that part in the United States Code kind of says it all. Speaking about conspiracy, one thing I would like to read very quickly that kind of shows that if, at least the federal government at bare minimum, that it's actually the government that is filled with conspiracy theorists, if anything, is if you look at 18 U.S. Code Section 371, conspiracy to commit offense or to defraud the United States. If 2 or more persons conspire either to commit any offense against the United States or to defraud the United States, or any agency thereof in any manner for any purpose, and 1 or more of such persons do not act to effect the object of the conspiracy, each shall be fined under this title or in prison not more than 5 years or both. The rest of this section goes on to describe qualifiers on the sentencing. So that's interesting. Conspiracy to commit any offense. So you have the much more specific one you just read, Shane, which is all about you cannot be around the president of the United States. Basically, you could say the king. and the royal family, people around the president or whatever. And then there's the more generalized one that the secret police definitely use, which is that, oh, well, we can't prove that you actually did anything, but we'll just claim that you were involved in a conspiracy and leave it at that. Next thing you know, you're incarcerated, and it's good luck trying to pay your bills from inside the government dungeons.
Because government loves you.
Exactly. Whereas a wise man once told me, violence is fun.
So let's move forward here. Hearsay rules. Kyle, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the hearsay rules is something that a lot of people don't really understand. I wrote about this before, at least in one article of mine, if not more so. The main idea here is the Federal Rule of Evidence 801 paragraph D, subparagraph 2, I guess subparagraph A, as well as the Texas Rule of Evidence 801 paragraph E, subparagraph 2, subparagraph A. Both say, quote, a statement is not hearsay if the statement is offered against a party and is the party's own statement in either an individual or a representative capacity, close quote. So this is why I've told people before, this is precisely why I think it's the wisest course to say nothing, deny nothing, and give them nothing to work with. It's also in much the same way, it's also the same reason why it's utterly foolish to make statements, no matter how innocent they may initially appear. I know one adage has been kind of offered is the master asks the questions and the servant answers them. So if you're in a police encounter, a police interrogation, whether it's at the side of the road or at a station house or anywhere else, pay attention to who's asking questions and who's answering said questions. That'll kind of tell you what the balance of power is, or not even a balance, where the power lies. Let me put it that way.
And don't say anything under your breath. I hate that.
Right. And again, there's a reason for that Miranda warning, right? Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. And so if that's true, let's extrapolate a little bit here. If you say a lot, then a lot can be used against you. If you say little, then little can be used against you. Thus, if I've been correct so far, if you say nothing, then nothing can be used against you. So it would therefore, you would make sense to say as little as possible if you were going to say anything at all. So yeah, watch out for those hearsay rules. That can really trip you up.
Yep, and I think this is important as well. A lot of people they like having police officer friends, and I know I personally would suggest people not have police officer friends, and I'm sure both of you hold the same opinion. Because even if you like cops, even if you want to be around them, even if you are a big government status, that doesn't keep you safe because of the plain view and hearsay rules. So if he's off duty and you're sitting there talking like, oh yeah, I'm in my basement making moonshine or whatever, like, which would be stupid to say. He could definitely use that against you in a court of law, even if he's off duty.
Yeah.
So I think that's important.
Yeah, equal opportunity oppression.
Christ. Okay, let's move forward here to this next segment on property rights. So Kyle, why don't you get started with some civil asset forfeiture?
Okay, civil asset forfeiture, I actually got interviewed about this before, and it's a topic worth getting into. But to just mention it briefly here, civil asset forfeiture, simply put, is legalized exaction. It's based on this medieval legal concept of the deodand, and the assumption here, crazy as it sounds, is that inanimate objects are capable of moral agency, and so therefore you have these in rem proceedings where things like due process basically don't apply. I know that may sound incredible to many listeners who have not heard of civil forfeiture before, but again, to explain it more thoroughly would require doing that at a different time. But suffice it to say that that's kind of what's going on here. So when you have court cases with names like United States versus $100,000 or the state of Texas versus 1234 real property or whatever, those are not real court cases, by the way. I'm just giving you the idea of the types of court cases and such. Those are in rem proceedings. So even though the owner of said property, whether it be a house, a car, businesses, computers actually have been in court cases, money, like whether it's in the form of physical cash or like bank deposits, like in bank accounts, checking accounts, savings accounts, things like that. Jewelry, and this is where the survivalists really need to keep an eye on for, bullion, precious metals, gold and silver, can even be civilly forfeited, by the way. You really got to be, that's something to really kind of keep in mind, and especially when considering, like, what proper rights do we have? The government can just swoop in, not accuse you of having committed any crime, but simply just claim that, well, this piece of property, we think it's tainted. It's called the taint doctrine. But because we think it's tainted, therefore we're going to basically prosecute the car, like a Ford Thunderbird or something. In fact, there was a gentleman here in Texas that actually lost his pickup truck, and it got litigated all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court. And the dissenting minority basically said, "Yeah, we're in deep doo-doo here. This is a serious problem." And all that. And I've written about that before, so if people want to learn more details, I think they should kind of follow up on that on their own time. But yeah, civil forfeiture is very much part of the police state, and it's how you also fund a police state too.
And I think it's important to mention, too, on the topic of civil asset forfeiture, that, like you said, there doesn't have to be really any evidence. They can just take it and then ask questions later. And the person that lost the property is the one that has to prove his innocence.
Yes.
And a lot of times, like, let's say they take the bank accounts, for example. If they take your money and you have nothing left, how are you going to fight that? You just can't. You can't.
Yeah, it's a catch-20. It's a catch-22, yeah, and they intend it that way, too, by the way.
Yep, indeed. So let's move forward to right to travel, shall we?
Yes.
Okay. So I think it's important to reiterate this point from Roger Roots' Are Cops Constitutional? Road travel itself is subject to a near total level of police control. And let's just kind of go through some of these checkpoints that they have. I know you're all aware of checkpoints. There's just random police checkpoints. There's sobriety checkpoints. There's child seat checkpoints, there's seatbelt checkpoints, and southern border or immigration checkpoints, which typically are like 50 miles off the border, so I don't think that's really intention. But, yeah, there's a lot of ways that they violate the right to travel. Would you agree with that, Kyle?
Oh, absolutely. And, yeah, and that's not even counting the security checkpoints or whatever at the different airports and such, too. I mean, the point is that there's lots of different types of checkpoints. And so it's very much a, papers, please. Please show me your papers. I think the Germans did that during the 40s, didn't they?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, oops.
Uh-oh. Well, let's move forward to traffic stops. Kyle, what is the plain view rule?
The plain view rule, and I think you mentioned a little bit earlier regarding when you were mentioning about hearsay. The plain view rule is that basically anything that happens within the five senses of an officer, usually his sight, but maybe if he hears something like a woman screaming or whatever, or anyone screaming, although they do tend to be biased that way too, for other reasons. Basically, anything that happens within the officer's five senses, he can act on. It's subject to investigation. So if anything looks suspicious, kind of like part of unjust profiling that you had me on about before, anything that is suspicious, that means I have to investigate. Let me trundle on over in my, blue costume and act all important. That's pretty much what plain view rule is. So, like, for example, at a traffic stop, the cop can, like, look through your windows and see what's in the back seat. And unfortunately, the federal judiciary and the several state judiciaries similarly have ruled that if the driver hasn't covered everything up, then whatever the officer can see, he can try and establish probable cause to, harass the driver or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that one's extremely dangerous as well. Like, let me give you a scenario. Like, you're just driving down the road and get pulled over by a cop, and he says that he smells marijuana or something.
Mm-hmm.
Even if there's not, like, he can blatantly lie about that. Blatantly lie. So at that point, you're going to be subject to an investigation. You're going to be sat there and harassed for probably 20 minutes or longer. While they search your car, and any damage done to your car, they aren't liable for. So if they destroy your seat
or any property on your person, for that matter,
kind of like that qualified immunity I mentioned earlier comes into play here too.
Yeah, and let's say, for example, back to the civil asset forfeiture thing. Let's say you have like $5,000 on you. Like, say you're going to buy a car or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's what happened to George Rebbe. Yeah,
they suspected of, or he says that he suspects it of being tainted drug money or something, and they can just take it. They can literally just take it. So it's very dangerous.
That is exactly what happened to George Revy. Yeah. So without getting into his case exactly, what you said is exactly right, and that's just what it is.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the dangers of becoming unbanked when you have to carry a lot of cash on you, because you got to be very careful with that. Mm-hmm. Let's move forward to vehicle impoundment. Let's say, for example, they do find marijuana in my ultimate or my imaginary scenario, I mean, I know here locally, they have to impound the car if they find paraphernalia. So you have a theft of property as well. They steal your car, and then you have to pay a few $100 to get it out. And each day it sits there, it increases quite substantially.
It's a ransom.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ever appreciating ransom.
Yep, indeed. And let's talk about regulations here. So a lot of people say that we're free in this country, but they're obviously delusional. But some regulations. What do you have to get to legally drive a car? Well, got to get your driver's license, auto insurance, title, registration, license plate. All of those are rather expensive, and you have to renew at least a couple of those yearly, and one of those you have to pay every single month. So it's quite pricey. And it's important to note here that the government police are the ones forcing compliance for these various regulations. They're almost a way to put it would be they're acting like armed bureaucrats.
Right, and then during a traffic stop, that's why a lot of times they'll ask for your driver's license. So they say, "Oh, can I nab them on that?" And then when you hand it over, it's like, shoot, I can't nab them on that. And then they'll try and ask you other questions to see if they can nab you on something. It's a shotgun approach. It's like, can I slap an arbitrary mala prohibita on this driver now that I've pulled him over, even if it wasn't for something that I originally suspected on him before, because it turns out I was wrong, even according to the standards of whatever legalese the cop's following. Yeah. I mean, it's completely just a bureaucratic nightmare. And the cops are very much, in a way, kind of like the armed version of that. Again, they're not chasing bank robbers. They're not stopping rapists. They're not, like actual mala in say, this is all mala prohibita, and it's very much done by way, a lot of it is done. Yeah. Well, yeah. But, there's no real crimes here, right? It's all victimless, administrative agency nonsense, unfortunately.
Yep. Unfortunately, that is the case. I think we can hit this before we go to break. Viper teams, which we mentioned some in unjust profiling. Kyle, what are Viper teams in a couple of scenarios that have happened that have actually been reported on mainstream local news?
Well, the Viper teams are basically, I kind of mentioned when we did the episode before on unjust profiling, but basically these are the guys that go around and they're trying to kind of extend the idea of TSA beyond just the airports or certain like limited areas, like sometimes they'll have TSA at malls or whatever. The Viper teams are like roving patrols that just warrantlessly and randomly search people. This happened in both, I think it was at a Greyhound bus stop, I think it was in Tampa, Florida, and then there was another one somewhere in Georgia where the Viper teams were actually forcibly pulling over truck drivers and inspecting and like X-raying and the other truck drivers. I think that's part of that profiling archive you've got on the LUA site too, so people can grab that video as well as others. But yeah, that's what the Viper teams are for. They're just roving bands of, I'm going to search your stuff whether you like it or not, and say hi to my husky who'll bite your hand off if you don't bend over and do what I want. And that's now the only good thing about this is at least they're not more common than they already are. But the point is that it's been documented they go around and do this stuff. So at this point, it's just how much of a threat are they? And then, of course, that's something that could be debated at another time. But the point is, they're active and they're doing stuff now, roving around and just forcibly searching people. No probable cause, no warrant, no nothing.
Yep. Indeed. So, Matt, you got any thoughts up to this point, brother?
I could guess a good phrase or description of them would be the Praetorian Guard.
Yeah, I could agree with that. I could definitely agree with that. But yeah, this is all ludicrous. I mean, we've gone through a lot of stuff already this evening, and we've still got another one to go through. But when we come back from this break here, we're going to look at SWAT team raids, the various types of those. We're going to look at the war on drugs and narcotics prohibition, and nuisance abatement. And this is a section you definitely don't want to miss. So we'll be right back after this short break.
Number one is unpopular with those that don't possess the binoculars to see. It has less to do with me than humanity being free collectively.
Mr. President, members of Congress, you've been making a lot of noise about taking our guns away. But you might want to review history. 1835, Gonzales, Texas Territory. The authorities wanted to confiscate the big gun that protected that colony. You know what the people said? Come and take it. Because they were willing to fight for their freedom and their guns. So are we.
Come and take it if you want it. Come and take it if you think you can. Come and take it, but I warn you, you'll have to pry it from my cold dead hands. We want the freedom that God gave us, so you best not cross that line. If you want this gun, you gotta come through us and take it.
One shot at a time. Just like Gonzales, we're keeping our guns.
doTERRA Essential Oils, true gifts of the earth, provide you with the perfect prepper tool, the Family Physician Kit. 10 certified pure, therapeutic-grade oils to provide the care you need for your family's everyday health concerns and potential medical issues you may encounter when sheltering in place or bugging out.
Visit EssentialNewParadigm.info to view the complete product line and ask how you can receive 25% off each and every order.
Don't delay. Your family's health depends on you. Health depends on you.
This is Niz from Disassociation Nation. As many of you know, I'm an avid vapor. And if you're like me, you're tired of being charged ridiculous amounts of cash for a disappointing experience when flavors just don't deliver. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to Vapor Renew, a Flavor West company. If you're into mixing and creating your own custom e-liquids, Flavor West has everything you need to make delicious, satisfying flavors. Doesn't matter if you're a flavor chaser or if you love the look and feel of those big, beautiful, puffy plumes. FlavorWest.com can provide you with everything you need. Let's face it, if you vape, e-liquid is an ongoing expense. And if you're a dripper like me, then you know that blowing through a $30 bottle of juice isn't unheard of. Why pay more than you have to? So for excellent quality juice made right here in the United States, head over to VaporRenew.com where they have hundreds of flavors pre-mixed and ready to vape at the most reasonable prices you'll find. Use coupon code RENU for an extra 10% off your entire order. Great juice at a great price and 10% off. Support companies that support liberty by making your next purchase at Vapor Renew. Or for mixing supplies, don't forget FlavorWest.com.
Thanks for listening to FPRN. Don't forget to check us out on Facebook and Twitter. If you'd like to start your own show with FPRN, advertise with us, or donate to the network or to your favorite shows, check out our website at www.fprnradio.com.
Imagine me and you, I do. I think about you day and night. It's only right to think about the girl you love and hold her tight, so happy together.
And welcome back to the final segment of tonight's edition of Liberty Under Attack Radio on the Freedom Phalanx Radio Network. I'm your host, Shane, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Matt and Kyle Rearden from the Last Bastille blog. If you've enjoyed what you've heard so far, I recommend you go check out the Liberty Under Attack YouTube channel for my various rantings and ravings. Got a video exposing the SPLC. I just put up another one last night of explaining my transition from a minarchist to my current anarchist positions. So definitely recommend you go check that out. I also recommend you check out Kyle's blog as well at the lastbastille.wordpress.com. He has enough articles on there to keep you busy for a long time. We'll just say that. So Kyle, let's move forward into some SWAT team raids.
Well, yeah, and I'm sure that guys remember, a lot of the Patriots remember that even back when George Bush Jr. was still in office, that there were the no-knock or warrantless raids. A version on a theme of this was that there were also the sneak and peeks. So basically, the government, even though their limitation is that they can search people, but they need like that little thing called a warrant. Apparently, they have trouble doing that. It's amazing how that happens, right? So, and then of course, people are also surprised when they when certain homeowners think that, kind of like I mentioned earlier, that they think that they're getting burgled in the middle of the night, and so they grab their guns and start at least brandishing it, if not sometimes discharging it too. So consider the safety of these nighttime raids that the SWAT teams do.
Yeah, I think it's also important to mention, which we kind of mentioned in passing before, though, the wrong house raids by the anonymous informants that are probably police officers. But we can't prove every single instance of that, obviously. But it's a pretty good hypothesis, I guess you could say. So let's move forward into the war on drugs and narcotics, or war on drugs or narcotics prohibition. I'd like to discuss some statistics done with some statistics on these raids. Most of these raids are done because of drugs. An ACLU report titled "War Comes Home," they found out that 54% of raids. 54% of raids took place against minorities, and of that 54%, 68% of them were for drug-related cases. In another report by the ACLU from 2011 to 2012, they found that 62% of overall SWAT team raids were searches for drugs. So I guess the takeaway from that is the war on drugs, narcotics prohibition has surely expanded the police state, surely have, and to consider some of the to consider how deadly these raids are. For 62% of them in 2011 to 2012, for them to be for vices, victimless crimes, I don't know. That really doesn't really sit right with me. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, consider that, I know some people may not like me saying this, but remember that a lot of the Tea Partiers, or at least portions thereof, were very much in favor of narcotics prohibition because, them drugs are hurting our children. And then it was interesting. Then it turned out later that, well, actually, we don't like this police state. And it's like, well, how do you think it got that way? At least in part.
Duh.
Whether you're talking about the incarceration rates, the prison industrial complex, or you're talking about, which is mainly nonviolent drug offenders, or you're talking about these SWAT raids, it's like anything. Look, listen. Anybody who believes in reformism just needs to understand something. The only time the state ever agrees to do anything by way of legislation or any other method is when it sees in its own self-interest, a tyrannical self-interest, to expand its own power. This is why the state likes environmental legislation. It's why it likes narcotics prohibition and so forth. So I bet all the conservatives feel pretty stupid now, and they should be. They should feel stupid because they supported all this crap. And look what happened. And it's about time.
A fair point to mention with regards to the drug war is the government actually has backed drug cartels in Mexico and other situations. So,
yeah, it's.
Well, I guess that's against the drugs. They'll also, use it somewhere else where nobody can see it and basically get away with it.
Yeah, and that's also another kind of a good point right there. Is we all know that marijuana isn't deadly at this point, obviously. But the fact is they have a monopoly on all sorts of things when it comes to the war on drugs. So they definitely have a major self-interest, and they've been caught red-handed smuggling drugs in the United States. So have the big banks, but they definitely have a self-interest. So, Kyle, let's move forward. What is nuisance abatement? I think this is a subject that a lot of people don't. I know I was kind of unaware of it. I didn't know what the actual term was. I've seen instances of it. But what is nuisance abatement?
Nuisance abatement, in many ways, is even more obscure than civil forfeiture. But basically, the vernacular way of putting it, Shane, is that it's a way of punishing landowners for enjoying their own private property. It's basically a lot of bureaucratic red tape, and it's mainly used by a lot of municipal and county governments. Basically, here's how it works. The bureaucrats accuse landowners of committing civil infractions. And then the fines start piling up and all that. And then, of course, because they can't afford the fines, they either have to move out of their own homes or even sell their land and so forth. I remember one couple that was written about even in mainstream media where they had to actually disassemble their own home. And this was they were kind of on the later end of midlife, as it were. So not quite elderly, but kind of getting there. And so they had lived this was like in the California desert. They had lived there for 2 or 3 decades. But because these new nuisance abatement ordinances came into play, they found themselves subject to them. And, that's part of the police state too. running people off their own land.
Yeah, and I want to mention one, I guess, example of that, and it's pretty recent. For the Kentucky 10, the homesteaders that lived off-grid, they had their children kidnapped. And this is from RT. Quote, a Kentucky off-the-grid family had their 10 children seized by authorities last month. The children went to 4 different foster homes, and the reason for the seizure was because their neighbor snitched on them for a supposed incident that is yet to be verified, by me at least. The reason for taking the children was due to supposed unsafe conditions, as stated by the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. So unsafe living conditions because, they were off-grid. And in a lot of places, they actually have, correct me if I'm wrong, Kyle, but I think they've actually kind of taken measures to prevent people from homesteading and going off-grid.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was also that other case of that more elderly woman who was trying to save money by growing her own food, had an edible garden both in the back part of her property and her front yard, too. And they ran her off her own land, and she's homeless. And she was, at least once it was all over, she was homeless and so forth. So, you are basically forced to pay for those public utilities that, of course, the government has a monopoly on. But such is the way of government. If they have a monopoly on the provision of security services, or at least they imagine themselves to do so vis-a-vis government policing, then of course they're going to do it with other things like so-called public utilities, whether it's electricity or water or fill in the blank. And then, of course, anyone who doesn't want to, quote-unquote, voluntarily pay for those things, but instead live off-grid, much like most people did in the 19th century, by the way, then you're evil, I don't know, terrorist, extremist, radical, or whatever the latest profiling, jizz word is this week.
Big bad phantom boogeyman.
Yeah, something like that. Notice too the CPSing of the kids. I mean, that itself would be a topic for another broadcast, but very much the whole Child Protective Services thing, like DFPS right here in Texas. That's very much administrative agency, absolutely. So, holy cow, what happened to that family is it's a barrage of bureaucratic diktats that they're suffering through right now.
Yeah, it's again, it's horrific. So, Kyle, what as far as if you had to guess, what as far as nuisance abatement, what could that potentially be a part of? Could it be corporate land development, or what could it be?
Well, it could be things like that. The government people want to run the owners off their own land so they could set up a shopping mall or some other sort of graft and corruption going on. I know many people of the Patriot community have kind of mentioned over the years about maybe even the implementation of United Nations, or maybe not much of a difference between the two at this point, but the United Nations Agenda 21, which is all about herding people into concentrated prison cities and making it illegal for people to basically be in rural areas and such. I honestly just don't know. But what I can say is that the nuisance abatement enforcement is happening. The only issue at this point would be, how prevalent is it and to what degree and how much at risk is the average landowner for suffering from nuisance abatement. But again, that would be something to handle at a different time, a different broadcast and such. But the point is that it is being used now. I mean, people have been running. I mean, people living in the California desert have been very much felt the boot of government, as it were. So in a sense, you could say that these are legalized range wars. The other side doesn't even have a chance to shoot back.
Yeah, that's true, and I think it's important to mention that when landowners are served the eviction notice, guess who it is that's actually there to enforce it? Well, it's police officers. They forcefully remove people from their own private property. Atrocious.
Yeah, and again, we're not talking about tenants who are a couple months back on the rent. We're talking about landowners being evicted. Oh, and that's the other thing. They own the land. Right. Well, of course, right, Matt. But we're not actually. Let me add one more qualifier. Not even people who mortgage these houses. These people own the property free and clear. There's no bank involved. There's no mortgage involved. So there's no rent. There's no mortgage, but they're still getting run off their own land. Think about the implications of that for a moment.
Yeah. Yep. It's not good. Definitely not good. So let's move forward to to our final segment in this broadcast, which is vice crimes and profiling. So Kyle, can you let us know what vices are? And you've already defined mala prohibita, but let's start there.
Government basically believes, and many statists do as well, that vices are essentially crimes, and as such, vices should be, or at least many of them, should be considered mala prohibita. There was even a guy who I who was actually running for a position in the Montana legislature, and I quizzed it. I called into another fellow's show about this and quizzed the candidate about this. His name was Judge Montforton. And I got him to admit that he does believe that some vices are crimes and people should be forcibly punished by government for engaging in vices. So I've actually had people tell me, in a very much public venue, as it were, on record, tell me that they think vices are crimes, or at least some vices are crimes. So this is very much a problem, very much evidence of a police state and such, so that when you see the criminalization of vices, I think that is pretty much proof positive you're living in a police state. And, of course, there are some pretty nasty consequences of this. One is that you have a rise in things like street gangs, organized crime, and even, confidence men, people that defraud folks just telling them lies and such. Invest in my Ponzi scheme and I'll make you rich, and then they run off with your money. But you also have, and I alluded to this earlier, but the prison industrial complex, right? America has the highest incarceration rate in the world, which is about a quarter of the world's prison population. Most of them are in there for victimless crimes. And as a kind of understandable consequence, you have an overcrowding of prisons, where you have multiple prisoners even being squished into, less and less floor space, as it were.
Yeah, and I would recommend that it was a recent article by Kyle on his blog, the lastbastille.wordpress.com, and he actually interviewed Casey Massey in regards to in regards to prisons. I guess how it's changed in the past 20 years or so, and I guess just what it's like to be in a government dungeon. So I definitely recommend you go check that out for a first-hand experience of what it is like in there. So Kyle, let's move forward. Unjust profiling.
Well, a lot of people like to make the notion that, we're in a post-9/11 world now, and that's different from pre-9/11. Yeah, baloney. Yeah. I mean, that would be a broadcast in of itself, just debunking that myth. But the point is that the government unjustly profiles citizens all the time. And I think you had me on to discuss this before.
Yep. Yeah, and for more details on the unjust profiling, make sure to tune into the broadcast we had with Kyle. It was on May 17th. You can find that at the FPRN if you go to shows, current shows, and to our archive. You can check that out. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think another element here too is that's definitely part of a police state and is used to kind of profile people in a sense, or at least collect intelligence on them. Is I actually kind of go back a while back, is dragnet wiretapping, and as well as the larger surveillance apparatus that, of course, my hero and yours, Edward Snowden, basically screamed bloody murder about and got the evidence of and so forth. So, I mean, whether we're talking
surveillance,
absolutely. So whether we're talking about the reform of the reform that, of course, doesn't reform a damn thing, like FISA or the FISA Amendments Act or data mining or fusion centers or any of this other stuff. When you have a government engaging in dragnet wiretapping, that by itself also shows that you're in a police state. Again, that's what Nicolae Ceausescu did in Romania.
Yeah.
And look what happened to him.
Mm-hmm. And again, we did have an interview with Kyle on dragnet wiretapping. And again, if you go to our archives, that was on March 29th. So you can tune into that too. And I think a good point here is to mention for all of members of the LP, reformism does not work.
We gotta love that FISA, right?
So, Oath Keepers. How does this tie into the Oath Keepers? How do they tie into this?
Well, remember, a lot of the Oath Keeper guys were unjustly profiled as being anti-government fill in the blank, and they don't deserve that. However, let's look at what they actually did and what they actually are. I think it would be fair to say that these guys are just a batch of reformists, right? They want to work within the system. Let me be a little bit more concrete. They have said for years that they want to remind police officers and active duty law enforcement and veterans, and I think they had firefighters at one point, of their duty to uphold the Constitution, the federal one of 1787, and to obey it. And if you do that and remind these guys of their oath, that will mystically solve everything. But then, of course, there was the fake drone attack last year at the Bunny Ranch. So there was a lot of nasty fallout from that, especially when you consider how the Oath Keepers pitted themselves against the different militia units, which was actually a rather interesting carnival sideshow that turned out to be. And I know Gary Hunt wrote about that at length to kind of explain what the hell happened.
Yeah, and I did. I watched the Bundy Ranch debrief here recently, and I did want to mention this. I don't know. There was Stuart Rhodes was okay, I guess. There was one guy. On the right in the video, and instead of actually saying anything substantial or anything important, he just and the entire time was just talking about how he's a combat veteran and how he's better than this other guy and how the other guy's a pussy because he didn't show up and all of this stuff. And it was just really, I don't know. It was bad. It was bad.
Was that
really
the debrief? Was that the debrief video they had?
Yes.
I think he said something too, like I'm a 3%er. And then, of course, for the patriots who understand that, and obviously 3%er means that at some point, indescribably, once they come for the guns, although something on the order of 3,000 some odd firearms have already been civilly forfeited in Texas since at least the 2000s. So we already have gun confiscation, by the way, through civil forfeiture. It just but anyway, the 3%ers expecting them to be consistent is like asking for the government to actually respect our rights. It's just not going to happen. But the 3%ers are like, well, what's kind of implied, like with Mike Vanderbilt and those guys, is that once the gun confiscation happens, they're basically going to shoot the cops. Kind of along the lines of what Larkin Rose and Chris Campbell wrote about that I mentioned earlier. And I just don't see them doing that. I mean, the guy you were mentioning where he was saying about I'm doing his braggadocio routine. He said, and a 3%er, right? Like that makes him special somehow, announcing his intentions ahead of time that he wants to shoot cops. Now, whether shooting cops is desirable or not is a topic for another time. But the point is that this guy's bragging about this kind of stuff and how he's wonderful and such.
Yeah, I think it's important too. I mean, we gave you some excerpts from our Cops Constitutional and we posted that in the chat. But getting them to respect their oath is ineffective because their existence alone is unconstitutional. So
yeah, that's before they go out and do anything.
Yeah, you see a little bit of I don't know. I guess you could call it hypocrisy. I guess a little bit. But yeah, let's move forward. We only got about 8 minutes left in this broadcast. We're definitely going to go over, so you guys are going to get a little extra bit of Liberty Under Attack Radio this evening. Let's move on. Accusing. I know that police and also the government in general, they like to accuse political prisoners of being mentally ill in whatever fashion, whether it be drug use or whether it be that they're conspiracy theorists or whatever it may be. They very heavily like to accuse political prisoners of being mentally ill. So Kyle, why don't we just kind of run with that here for a moment?
Well, I mean, this is what the communists in the Soviet Union did against the political dissidents there. Anyone who didn't agree with the communists and did not want to live under a communist dictatorship by the Communist Party there. By the way, did I say communist? Oh, yeah, okay, just remind everybody. The communists did this crap, okay, in the Soviet Union. And what they would do is that they would take the dissidents of various flavors, colors, and stripes, and they would throw them, not in the gulag necessarily, although they did that too, don't get me wrong, but they would throw them into the pasuskas, basically the mental hospitals. And in a lot of ways, that was actually worse than being in the gulag because now they're attacking your very sanity. Because, of course, you take any mentally healthy person, you put them basically in solitary confinement, and they start to go slowly insane, and so forth. So it's very, very bad, to put it mildly. And unfortunately, there are laws in the books, even here in Texas, about certain conditions when they can do that. And I think that was also mentioned in that previous interview we did. More details about that.
Yep. And this obviously ties into the CPS again because, well, they get the parents to, I guess the bureaucrats interrogate the parents and find out if they can steal these kids or not. And then they get the cops to go and do the kidnapping. So again, the cops tie into this too, and it's atrocious. It's definitely atrocious.
Well, the bureaucrats notice how the bureaucrats are working alongside the social workers specifically, are working alongside the cops, or otherwise in other encounters they're taking the lead. So generally speaking, what happens is that the bureaucrats are interrogating the parents and sometimes even doing searches. But then when it comes time for the actual kidnapping part, they usually show up at, knock, 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 and they're like, oh, we're here to actually take the kid. Here's Officer Do-Good, So that's very interesting. That's actually when the system's being a little bit more honest with you about just how authoritarian it is. If they can steal people's children like that, then do parents really have any sort of even temporary guardianship over their own children, even? If the state can just come in and just, whisk them away at a moment's notice.
That's a good question. It's definitely
Combine that too with the house raids we mentioned earlier. Remember the whole grab bag thing, like during when we were mentioning about traffic stops? What if they? So let me postulate something real quick. So let's say the cops do a SWAT team militarization type thing against the wrong house, and then when they're on the wrong house, they don't like something about the way the people are living. There are children there, and then they decide to CPS the kids. So you can kind of see where different elements can very much start influencing one another, and that's why it's usually best not to try and not be around these cops or as much as possible. Sometimes it is impossible, but you do what you can.
Yeah. Okay, let's move forward here. I'd like to discuss extraordinary rendition and torture. So I'll provide a definition for that for those that are unaware. Extraordinary rendition is imprisonment in foreign territories of separate countries and or international waters. So Matt, why don't you take it away? Let us know about Maher Arar and what happened to him.
All right. Mehdi Hassan, in his Guardian article, Syria has made a curious transition from U.S. ally to violator of human rights, from February 19, 2012. Quote, Arar, a telecommunications engineer born in Syria, moved to Canada as a teenager in 1987 and became a citizen in 1991. On September 26, 2002, he was arrested at JFK Airport in New York, where he had been in transit on his way home to Canada after a family holiday abroad. Following 13 days of questioning, U.S. authorities, suspecting Arar of ties to al-Qaeda based on flawed Canadian police intelligence, rendered him not to Canada, where he lived, but to his native Syria, from where his family had fled 15 years earlier. For the next 10 months, he was detained without charge in a 3-foot by 6-foot Syrian prison cell, where, according to the findings of an official Canadian Commission of Inquiry, he was tortured. Arar says he was punched, kicked, and whipped with an electrical cable during 18-hour interrogation sessions. Continuing.
Wow.
In another example, Andy Worthington, in his book, The Guantanamo Files, from December 2007, quote, one dubious example of a fighter captured was Omar Khadr, who was shot 3 times by U.S. soldiers during a firefight near Khost on July 2002, and is nearly blind in one eye as a result of his injuries. According to the U.S. military, he killed a U.S. soldier during the fight, and as a result, even though he was seriously injured, his interrogation began as soon as he was taken into custody. During his detention in Afghanistan, he asked for pain medication for his wounds, but was refused, was threatened with dogs while hooded during interrogations, and was not allowed to use the bathroom, and was forced to urinate on himself. Khadr, who arrived in Guantanamo in October 2002, a few weeks after his 16th birthday, was immediately subjected to humiliation. Once, the guards left him until he urinated on himself, and then poured a pine-scented cleaning fluid over him, and used him as a human mop to clean up the mess. As if further humiliation was required, he added that he was not provided with clean clothes for several days after this degradation. In the case of Omar Khadr, the men from Tipton reported that he was persistently refused painkillers for the wounds he sustained in Afghanistan, and that on one occasion, when he was very, very badly ill in an isolated cell, the medics said that they couldn't see him because the interrogators had refused to let them. A few facts and opinions regarding Guantanamo. Number 1, Guantanamo Bay has remained consistently open, despite Obama's hopey, changey promise that it will be closed in 2008. It's been 8 years, and the facility remains in functioning order. Reformism, rather than abolishment, has been applied to the detention facilities. Number 2, TheJusticeCampaign.org cites several torture methods that have been used by those indefinitely detained in Guantanamo. Sexual assault and humiliation, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, solitary confinement, mock executions, forced medication, dogs to scare detainees, extreme temperatures, sensory bombardment, such as loud music, watching other detainees being tortured, psychological degradation, desecration of religious texts, such as the Quran, was reportedly prominent in 2005. None of these methods assertedly have fulfilled Bush's war on terror promise of supposedly stopping terror, merely instigating it to occur more frequently. Again, the website is thejusticecampaign.org. Number 3. I'm almost done.
Oh, go ahead. You're fine. Go ahead.
Number 3. Like Camp Boca, helping ISIS rise to power in Iraq. The counter-terror measures of Guantanamo have led to released detainees growing more radicalized and increasing the threat of terrorism across the planet. Rather than deterring terrorists from ever bringing harm to people, the war on terror has created a terror industry of the tortured and geopolitically manipulated prisoners of facilities like Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, Bagram, and Kandahar Air Base. Because of these conditions, the terror-industrial complex is a thriving profiteering venture by the securocrats in the District of Columbia. Finally, the police state and the terror-industrial complex are one and the same entity. FBI entrapment, as mentioned earlier, is a great example of this axiomatic truth and parallels indefinite detention measures in Guantanamo and similar global prisons. Please check out my Q&A series, The Terror-Industrial Complex and You, for more information.
Okay. All right. Good deal. Good deal. So I did want to mention the Eighth Amendment here in regards to cruel and unusual punishment. Kyle, what is cruel and unusual punishment is in the Texas Constitution, correct?
Yes, it is. It is located at Article 1, Section 13, and it mentions excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishments are basically not allowed.
Okay. Well, I could find the first half of the in the Illinois Constitution. I found the first half. It's Illinois Constitution of 1970, by the way. I found the first half regarding bail, but it doesn't describe excessive bail. But in the Illinois Constitution, the Illinois Bill of Rights, it says nothing about cruel and unusual punishment. Not a mention. So I guess that the takeaway from that is the actions at Home and Square weren't completely illegal according to the state constitution. So,
well, it's at least an open question. That's kind of the problem. And so, I mean, is it really that much of a stretch to go from torture to something like extraordinary rendition? It's definitely bears worth examining for certain.
Yep, indeed. And Matt already kind of discussed enhanced interrogation and torture, but obviously, though, with the waterboarding, stress positions, playing loud, shitty music for days on end, sleep deprivation, forced nakedness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all would be unconstitutional. Unless they do it in a different country, I guess. So let's move forward to police unions. So, Kyle, kind of give us a good introduction to police unions, if you could.
This is probably one of the very worst elements, and the only real element of the police state I think would be worse than the secret police, but not quite as, or at least kind of right up there alongside the secret police and then the bureaucrats and attorneys more generally, would be these police unions, and they are very, very dangerous. The reason I say that is because police unions are essentially, what they are composed of is just simply lobbyists who advocate for the police state. They endorse political candidates, like how some police unions up in Wisconsin endorsed Scott Walker for the I think this was back in the 2014 Wisconsin gubernatorial election, if I remember correctly. They spend anywhere like $80,000. I think some of them spend about $80,000 annually on lobbying. I think that was released by some sort of Office of Public Records somewhere. So, I mean, think about that. So the cops basically unionize, and then they basically beg for more power and more weaponry and armor and fill in the blank.
Yeah, I'm getting that link in the chat if it'll let me. Okay, yeah, it's not going to. We'll move on. But yeah, I actually found a few examples of these police unions. We found a few examples of these police unions actually lobbying against some reforms that would give them a little less power. So first off, this is the Georgia Sheriff's Association said state civil forfeiture laws should not be changed for any reason during testimony for the House Judiciary Committee on Thursday, February 6th, 2014 at the Senate Capitol. HB 1 makes several changes to existing law. The video that we aren't playing tonight for reasons of time, begins with testimony by the Georgia Sheriff's Association Vice President Wiley Griffin. The committee passed the bill, which could receive a full House hearing as early as next week. They were against civil asset forfeiture reform because obviously they have a little self-interest in that, I would imagine. Another example, in the debate about mandated body cameras for police, local unions stated that it, quote, will distract officers from their duties and hamper their ability to act and react in dangerous situations, end quote. Wow. Another example in regards to demilitarization. A representative of the International Union of Police Associations wrote that, quote, I believe that law enforcement officers should have available to them any and all tools necessary to do their job and protect their community, end quote.
Except for those body cameras, right?
Yeah, so, obviously.
No transparency for you because you're just a plebeian schmuck.
Precisely. Another example is in regards to the New York Stop and Frisk program. Quote, we continue to have serious concerns about how these remedies will impact our members and the ability to do their jobs, end quote. And the last example is in regards to Philadelphia community relations. It was recommended by a civilian oversight commission that the police apologize to citizens who complain of being mistreated. The local chief of the Fraternal Order of Police responded by saying the commission was trying, quote, to further weaken and demoralize the Philadelphia department in a time of crisis with a significantly growing crime problem in the city. Your group poses a direct threat to public safety in this city, a threat which should no longer be tolerated by our citizens or their government. And I'm having trouble with the connection here. How apologizing to citizens who they violate civilly, how apologizing to them weakens the Philadelphia Police Department. I really don't understand that, but I'm probably not supposed to.
Yeah, and notice, I mean, we're not even talking about lawsuits at this point. This is just an apology, like saying I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. Saying I'm sorry would demoralize the police. Oh, we have to worry about their the feelings of the monopoly.
And I think they've probably already demoralized themselves enough without any assistance. So I don't think that's really an issue there. I mean, do they really even need any more morale boosters at this point? I wouldn't think so.
No, but I would like to mention something. Consider also the police unions are a union, like any other trade union. And very similarly, unlike the syndicalists that I mentioned earlier, your usual typical unions have union bosses. And with those union bosses, you've got some pretty nasty membership fees, and I would assume there would be some level of degree of graft and corruption and so forth from the membership.
No, of course. Why don't you kind of briefly explain the regulatory capture function of these police unions?
Excuse me, yeah. Well, again, this is more broadly with the administrative agencies, the bureaucracy, but yeah, you could apply it to the police unions as well. Regulatory capture is basically it's literally a form of political corruption whereby the government body that's supposed to be regulating some sort of element of presumably private or corporate industry basically pass regulations in favor of that industry. So, for example, the typical example of regulatory capture would be like the incestuous relationship between the FDA and Monsanto. It's a revolving door. So basically, what usually happens, at least with that case, people work at Monsanto and they do all sorts of things, and then they quit Monsanto and go to work at the FDA, and then they pass all sorts of administrative rule-making, which, of course, is a legislative function, as I mentioned in that previous interview I did with you. And next thing you know, then they quit FDA and then they go back to work at Monsanto. The usual individual that's given that's usually highlighted for this, of course, the Clarence Thomas, who I think he's still on the United States Supreme Court, if I remember correctly. So so he was very much a part of this whole revolving door phenomenon, which is more formally called regulatory capture. So it's a form of political corruption. So you have a situation whereby these corporatists can literally seize control of the bureaucracy. And then through that bureaucracy, they pass more legislation favorable to them, that, of course, gives them more power to issue orders to the cops. And then the cops go, yes, sir, how high shall I jump? And then they go and beat up protesters or whatever else.
Yeah, so I guess we're coming to the end of this broadcast. So, Kyle, Matt, kind of some closing thoughts to leave with our listeners.
I would just like people to keep an eye on my series on the Federalist Papers.
Okay. All right. And Matt, Kyle, any closing thoughts?
Sure. Whether we're talking about the risks of democide or the evils of mala prohibitum or civil forfeiture or CPS and or government policing in general and so forth, or the monopoly on the ability to practice law, all of these different elements and also others that we've covered tonight, I would hope really kind of demonstrate we're in a police state. And, if this isn't sufficient to bear the burden of proof, I don't know what is. But I think probably that's something kind of important to mention is, and this should really be kind of tackled at a different time, but a lot of people would ask, okay, you've proven a police state, how do you deal with it? Well, one thing I've already recommended to people is to role-play police interrogations. And there is actually a quote I would like to read very briefly from Karski's. This was a guy who was part of the Polish resistance during World War II. And Karski basically said, quote, "In June of 1940, the Germans staged a manhunt in the streets of Warsaw and seized about 20,000 people who were taken to 3 large police stations where they were searched, questioned, and had their documents verified. All those whose documents were not in perfect order, who could not give a satisfactory account of their ancestry, employment, and political sympathies, or could not clear themselves of charges made against them, were sent to concentration camps. We later learned that about 100 members of the underground were caught in this raid. They were, without a single exception, promptly released. Every one of those had his documents in perfect order, could prove his occupation, and supply a satisfactory account of his personal history. Everyone had ready answers to every question that were asked of him, and impressed the police by his clear, straightforward, and unhesitating manner," end quote. And again, that was from Jan Karski's biography, Story of a Secret State. So if you can learn how to deal with police when you are subject to an interrogation, whether it's during a traffic stop at the side of the road or in any other context, that can greatly mitigate, not a surefire thing by any means, but that can at least get you started in terms of learning how to deal with the police state. And again, Shane, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for joining us. We definitely enjoy having you on, and I think we covered a lot of important, good stuff tonight. And I would say that I think we've proven it. But just to kind of close this out, Hitchens' razor: "He who makes any claim bears the burden of proof." It has been our goal tonight to meet that burden of proof when we claimed at the beginning that America is a police state. It is not incumbent upon any critics to offer any evidence disproving the claims being made. Folks who are skeptical of the claims we have made here tonight are encouraged to double-check the veracity and truthfulness of the claims we have made here and to criticize us to their heart's content. It is our sincere wish that we have presented the most comprehensive yet brief overview of how and why the United States of America in the early 21st century is a police state. And to kind of reiterate Kyle's point there, the most important method that we recommend people to do, even statists, is that if they value their own personal freedom, they really should learn how to role-play police interrogations so as to stay out of prison, retain their property, and to make confrontations go more smoothly. Any proposed efforts to rein in the police state or otherwise abolish it is more appropriate for future broadcasts, videos, articles, etc. Just want to thank you all for tuning in to another broadcast of LUA Radio. We highly recommend you share this broadcast with your doubter and police sympathizer friends. Also, make sure to check out the upgraded website and Matt's most recent article titled Anarchist Odyssey of the Federal Papers Part 1. Again, that link is tiny.cc/anarchist-odyssey. Make sure to tune in next week when we are joined by Cal Molinay, an anarchist from Richmond, Virginia. Always remember, we certainly live in a violent, monopolistic, freedom-destroying police state. It's about time to start acknowledging it if we're going to have any chance of restoring our liberty. We'll see you next week. Have a great evening, everyone.
Take care and good night.
Thanks for listening to FPRA. Don't forget to check us out on Facebook and Twitter.
If you'd like to start your own show with FPRN, advertise with us, or donate to the network or to your favorite shows, check out our website at www.fprnradio.com.
We're all running inside this grave. I know for